Many of us know and have heard of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but not as many of us have heard of the book that actually preceded it all and inspired Bram Stoker to write Dracula, Carmilla, by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Recently, I read Carmilla because I'm a sucker for the original vampire books. Not only do I think it's fascinating for us to examine one of the very first depictions that we have of vampire legends, I also think it's interesting to examine this book in the context of today's standards in terms of writing as well. It reveals a lot about the subjectivity of what makes something good writing, cultural attitudes, and also the gradual evolution of legends in our collective consciousness. So let's talk about it. Let me tell you about one of the very first vampire stories. So Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu was an Irish Gothic author who lived from 1814 to 1873, and he wrote Carmilla in 1872, a year before he died. Now, Bram Stoker's Dracula was published in 1897, 25 years after Carmilla. Bram Stoker was also an Irish Gothic author, and as you'll see, he stole a lot of ideas from Carmilla. Carmilla takes place in an Austrian schloss, or castle, in a wild old forest. Just a few kilometers away, there are the ruins of a castle and village that have been abandoned. Laura, a teenage protagonist, is living at the schloss with her British father and their housekeepers. When she was a young girl, Laura woke up one night to find a woman in her room leaving some sort of piercing pain in her chest. The years go by. As a teen, Laura's father's friend is supposed to be coming to visit them with his daughter, but he sends news at the last moment that his daughter has died. In his letters, which sound a little bit crazed, he blames the infatuation of a woman he let into his home for his daughter's death. Laura's disappointed because she's a bit starved for social interaction with peers her age. She's living in this very wild forest, so understandably she wants some friends to hang out with. Well, one day after she and her dad are walking in the evening in the woods, a gorgeous young woman and her mother come by the schloss. The mother says she needs to go urgently on business and asks Laura's father to look after her daughter Carmilla for 3 months. Laura's dad agrees and they take in Carmilla. Laura realizes pretty soon after that Carmilla looks just like the woman who was in her room as a child. Carmilla too says she had a dream about her. Over the course of the next few months, Carmilla and Laura form a relationship that's a little bit unusual for the times. Carmilla seems, put simply, infatuated with Laura, and Laura too seems quite taken with Carmilla's beauty. You know, I had heard that this book had sapphic undertones, but I wouldn't call them undertones at all. They're overtones, plain and simple. More on that in a second. But at other times, Laura also finds herself quite disturbed by Carmilla. And as time goes on, more and more people start dropping dead around the premises. Laura starts to see creatures hovering over her bed at night. Carmilla disappears from her room with no explanation at nighttime. They find an image of one of Carmilla's predecessors, named Millarca Karnstein, and she looks exactly like Carmilla. The image is hundreds of years old, so how can that be? Laura becomes increasingly frail as the strange nighttime attacks become more frequent. And eventually, Laura's father's friend, who was supposed to visit them, finally comes by. They go for a walk in the woods. He definitely wants to see the ruins of the castle beyond the woods, and as they're walking towards the ruins, he tells them what he thinks happened with his daughter. A beautiful young woman named Countess Millarca and her mother came by and asked him to take in Millarca. He did. Millarca became obsessed with his daughter and eventually took her life. His theory is that Millarca was a vampire, a descendant of the Karnstein family who was living at the castle centuries ago. And she sucked the blood out of the villagers nearby until the whole village was abandoned. By the time the three of them get to the ruins, Laura has realized that Millarca equals Carmilla. They're one and the same. They find her tomb, they find the name Millarca Karnstein on the tomb, and they also find Millarca or Carmilla there. They kill her the way that vampires are killed, stake through the heart, chop off the head, all that good stuff. And that is essentially the plot of Carmilla. It's quite short, as you can see. Let's talk about the similarities and differences between Carmilla and Bram Stoker's Dracula. In Carmilla, we have a female vampire antagonist rather than a male one. In Dracula, it's of course the undead Vlad the Impaler, who is the big vampire threat. Whereas in this, it's Carmilla Karnstein. But you may notice if you've read Dracula, if you've seen Dracula in 1992, that Lucy's character has some pretty direct parallels to Carmilla. There are, of course, the sapphic undertones between Lusa and Mina that kind of mirror the sapphic undertones between Carmilla and Laura. Also, the scene in Dracula where they're going to raid Lucy's tomb to find her and kill her there is very reminiscent of the scene where they find Carmilla in her tomb. It's very apparent that Bram Stoker's depiction of Lucy was heavily inspired by Carmilla. Carmilla takes place in Austria, Dracula takes place in Transylvania and also partly the UK, but both take place in these rugged wild landscapes that kind of are meant to evoke this abandoned, othering, not quite civilized setting. More on racism in a sec. Both of them are also in diary forms, although Dracula has more POVs, Carmilla is mainly written from the point of view of Laura. Dracula also has other forms other than diary entries, such as newspaper clippings and so forth. Dracula is also more fleshed out and longer, and like I mentioned, Dracula also draws inspiration from Vlad the Impaler history, although both Dracula and Carmilla draw on a count or countess from an old extinct family belonging to an abandoned castle as the antagonist. So this brings up some really interesting questions that I'd love your thoughts on. Is all fiction derivative, or was Bram Stoker just a little bit shameless in how much he stole from Carmilla? In 200 years, will we see today's trends as clear-cut copycats too? Is it just the passing of time that helps us realize so clearly how much somebody stole from another person? Or is this just kind of how fiction always goes, that we're always adding on to each other's work and getting inspiration from each other's work? Again, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments because I do not know the answer. I think we can learn a lot about the times in which Carmilla was written by reading the book. Dracula's message at its essence, the way I see it, is mainly about xenophobia and Christian fear-mongering. It's basically about this Eastern man coming to corrupt the souls of British men's Western wives, to infect them with this bloodlust. And there's also, of course, the Victorian purity ideals. I know that this is definitely in Dracula 1992, the movie. I can't remember if it's also in the book, but there's a part when Anthony Hawkins' character, Van Helsing, talks about how civilization and civilization have evolved together. In the Victorian era, there started to be a little bit more concern with STDs. And of course, as part of the cultural pushback against that, there was this Christianity purity culture of only having intimate experiences within the context of marriage, and therefore the stigmatization of sexual promiscuity. All of these are cultural messages that are deeply ingrained into Dracula's message. Recently, when I rewatched Dracula 1992, I thought the message in that, since it was more of a modern creation than, Bram Stoker's Victorian era book, was actually more about fighting sexual temptation and disloyalty. I noticed that there was Mina's disloyalty in the sapphic undertones with Lucy, Lucy's disloyalty in how she was playing all three of her suitors, Jonathan's disloyalty with the three women in the castle. And of course, can't believe I forgot to mention this, Mina's disloyalty with Dracula. Duh. It's interesting how the fear-mongering in the book differed slightly from the fear-mongering in the movie that came years, centuries later. But Carmilla, I think its message is more about romantic obsession and fear-mongering lesbianism. The way that Carmilla is portrayed definitely seems consistent with kind of like an all-consuming, engulfing personality. And I think she's portrayed that way to scare women away from female-female affection, to make it seem like a slippery slope to be drawn to another woman. Let me read you some of the depictions of infatuation in Carmilla. Now, the truth is, I felt rather unaccountably towards the beautiful stranger. I did feel, as she said, drawn towards her, but there was also something of repulsion. In this ambiguous feeling, however, the sense of attraction immensely prevailed. She interested and won me. She was so beautiful and so indescribably engaging. She was slender and wonderfully graceful. Her movements were languid, very languid. Her complexion was rich and brilliant. Her features were small and beautifully formed. Her eyes large, dark, and lustrous. I never saw hair so magnificently thick and long when it was down about her shoulders. I have often placed my hands under it and laughed with wonder at its weight. It was exquisitely fine and soft, and in color a rich, very dark brown, with something of gold. I loved to let it down, tumbling with its own weight. As in her room she lay back in her chair talking in her sweet low voice, I used to fold and braid it and spread it out and play with it. She was blushing softly, gazing in my face with languid and burning eyes, and breathing so fast that her dress rose and fell with tumultuous respiration. It was like the ardor of a lover. It embarrassed me. It was hateful and yet overpowering, and with gloating eyes she drew me to her, and her hot lips traveled along my cheek in kisses, and she would whisper almost in sobs, "You are mine, you shall be mine, you and I are one forever." She was leaning back in her seat, her fine eyes under their long lashes gazing on me in contemplation, and she smiled in a kind of rapture. "You will think me cruel, very selfish, but love is always selfish. The more ardent, the more selfish. How jealous I am you cannot know. You must come with me, loving me to death, or else hate me and still come with me, and hating me through death and after. There is no such word as indifference in my apathetic nature." I mean, you hear this obsession of like, I have to have you so much that I need to have you even in death. I don't even care if you hate me. I need to completely possess you. It's this type of infatuation that's mixed with possession that truly shows the objectifying and not at all loving nature of these infatuations. How can you love someone when you don't care for their well-being? How can you love someone when you don't care if it's consensual? The vampire is prone to be fascinated with an engrossing vehemence, resembling the passion of love by particular persons. In pursuit of these, it will exercise inexhaustible patience and stratagem, for access to a particular object may be obstructed in 100 ways. It will never desist until it has satiated its passion and drained the very life of its coveted victim. But the crux of it actually comes at the end of the book, when we learn what turns someone into a vampire. How does it begin and how does it multiply itself? I will tell you. A person more or less wicked puts an end to himself. A suicide under certain circumstances becomes a vampire. That spectre visits living people in their slumbers, they die and almost invariably in the grave develop into vampires. How fucked up is that? Sheridan Le Fanu is basically suggesting that what turns somebody into a vampire is if they take their own life. I don't think I need to explain why this is wrong as a doctor of clinical psychology. People do not end their lives because of selfishness or because of wickedness or being evil. But that is what's kind of portrayed in the Bible. That is kind of the message that's given in Christianity, that it is a sin to take your own life because you don't have a right to. And this is also alluded to in Dracula the movie, the 1992 version, when we see Vlad the Impaler's wife throwing herself into the Argeș River. Again, it's a matter of being punished for doing something unchristian. So we definitely also have these Christian overtones in Carmilla as well. There's also a hint of racism for some reason, just like completely out of the blue. Then she described a hideous black woman with a sort of colored turban on her head who was gazing all the time from the carriage window, nodding and grinning derisively towards the ladies with gleaming eyes and large white eyeballs, and her teeth set as if in fury. Okay. And this, again, also parallels the kind of fear-mongering, xenophobia, racism that we see in Dracula as well. I mean, it was Victorian Era, written by Western authors who definitely had some racist worldviews, who definitely saw darkness as associated with evil. And I think also part of the reason why they go on these racist tangents in these books is because they want to scare people. They want to give this message that otherness is scary. Not only is it scary when it comes to the color of your skin, but also when it comes to the legend of the vampire. So that's what I think we can learn about the cultural attitudes of the time by reading Carmilla. Now let's talk a little bit about the stylistic differences with what's currently accepted as good writing in our landscape. In Carmilla, there was a lot of exposition in the beginning, a lot of telling rather than showing. Let me just read you an example. In Styria, we, though by no means magnificent people, inhabit a castle or schloss. A small income in that part of the world goes a great way. I and my father constituted the family at the schloss. My mother, a Styrian lady, died in my infancy, but I had a good-natured governess who had been with me from, I might almost say, my infancy. You get the picture. Ton of telling rather than showing, ton of exposition thrown at us in just the first couple pages. Does this make it bad? I don't think so. I actually don't have a problem with exposition, with telling rather than showing. It's just that we in our culture have decided that showing is superior to telling, that you have to weave in the exposition very deftly over the course of many chapters so that it's not overwhelming, so that the reader kind of forgets that they're reading. But it just goes to show you how relative and subjective and culture-bound our norms of good writing are. Just because a book breaks the current laws of good writing doesn't mean it's not a good book. And our norms of what makes writing good honestly reflects more about our culture than about the writing itself. For example, in the time that I'm writing this, we live in a very inattentive, fast-paced world, and books are supposed to get right to the chase, start in the middle of the action, not give any backstory, not take time to write beautiful details, focus on plot and character and dialogue over scene setting and themes. These are all rules that I break in my writing, by the way. I don't particularly give a fuck, but like that's kind of the norms of what is good writing in this day and age. And it's so reflective of what our culture is like, and it's so dynamic. As our culture changes, these norms will also change. My overall thoughts on the writing was that I found the book to be quite easy to visualize, despite how old it is. Usually when I read Victorian era writing, I find there's just something that doesn't quite click in my mind, but this one I thought was very crisp, very clear, very easy for me to visualize, which I like in a book. For example, at our left, the narrow road wound away under clumps of lordly trees and was lost to sight amid the thickening forest. At the right, the same road crosses the steep and picturesque bridge, near which stands a ruined tower which once guarded that pass, and beyond the bridge an abrupt eminence rises, covered with trees, and showing in the shadows some grey ivy-clustered rocks. Over the sward and low grounds, a thin film of mist was stealing like smoke, marking the distances with a transparent veil, and here and there we could see the river faintly flashing in the moonlight. In a lot of ways, I found the book to be written very matter-of-factly, which I don't really have an opinion on. Now, the contents of Carmilla, like the plot as I narrated it to you, would seem unoriginal in today's age. It would seem kind of like, okay, been there, done that. But considering it was one of the very first stories of its time to do this, that inspired hundreds, if not thousands of stories like it to this day and age, it was a trailblazer. It was the first of its genre in many ways. And it's who we can thank for all the other vampire stories that we have today. And it really makes me wonder, like, what will be the trailblazer of our times? You know, like in our modern period, modern era, what's going to be like the book that kind of kickstarts a trend that starts all other books? Maybe it's Harry Potter in some sense. Like I know witch books are really popular right now. And the concept of like encapsulating adolescents in a magical school where there are witches, maybe that has kind of kickstarted other things as well. I don't know, like what would you say has been the most influential book written in the past 50 years? Let me just end on some questions for discussion. If you've read Carmilla, what did you think of it? Because I always struggle to like rate old books, usually because they're like filled with really problematic stuff and like not written in the way that I would read a book today, but also like you gotta kind of appreciate them for what they were. So I'd love to hear what you thought if you've read it. And also, I've heard that there are other vampire books that actually inspired Carmilla. I'd be curious to go even further back to the original vampire novel, if there even is one that preceded this one. So I guess my question is, do you know what that one would be? Do you know like what it's called? And would you be interested in a video on that? More of these videos are going to pop up on your feed. Make sure you're subscribed and that you have the bell notification on if you don't already. And I will see you soon.